Hello, and welcome to this new video. Today we're going to go over the metaphysics of, for me, the greatest philosopher of all time, Immanuel Kant. So to begin, Kantian Metaphysics is based on the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, as well as a priori and a posteriori knowledge. So according to Kant, analytical judgments are those which the predicate is contained in the subject, and their truth is known by definition. Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, add something to the subject that is not contained in it, and therefore the truth is not immediate or not immediately evident based on the concept alone. So a priori is independent of the experience and knows through reason alone, while a posteriori knowledge is something derived from experience. So synthetic, you can combine these terms. So synthetic, which we just mentioned, and a priori, they can go together to make synthetic a priori judgments. So synthetic a priori judgments are those that add something new to our understanding and are known independent of experience, and synthetic a priori judgments are fundamental to Kantian metaphysics. So these categories are fundamental structures of our mind, the synthetic a priori judgments, and it allows us to organize experiences and make sense of reality, as without them, we won't have knowledge of the world at all. So analytical a posteriori propositions are true by definition and also rely on observation or experience. However, if a judgment is analytically true, then we know this a priori. So, because we don't need definition to tell us something that's contained in the concept itself. So, for this reason, there are no such thing as analytical a posteriori judgments. Synthetic posteriori judgments, in contrast, are based on experiences that add something new to our understanding of the object. For example, you can have the apple is red, for example, and that's a synthetic posteriori proposition, because the property of being red is not contained in the concept of an apple. Like you can have yellow apple or green apple, and it can all be known through empirical observations or experiences of an apple. So analytical a priori propositions are true by definition and don't rely on empirical observations or experience. For example, if I said all bachelors are unmarried, it's also an analytical a priori proposition, because it'd be known through the analysis of the concept alone and without the need for empirical observation or experience. So going back to synthetic a priori propositions, bit of a tongue twister. So as mentioned earlier, they're based on reason and are not dependent on empirical observation or experience. So for example, if I said every event has a cause, it's a synthetic a priori proposition because it's not a definition or tautology, and it can't be known through empirical observation alone. However, it can be known through reason and reflection on the nature of causality. So Kant attempted to synthesize the rationalist and empirical tradition. So since he said that, quote, that David Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. So rationalists like Descartes and Ibn Sina, or Descartes, it's made a video about him, so you should check that out. But so Descartes and Ibn Sina believe that there's knowledge that is a priori or independent from experience, while empiricists like David Hume and Locke believe the opposite. So Hume was critical of the traditional notions of causation, and he argued that belief in cause and effect isn't grounded in reason, but rather in custom and habit. And he argued that there is nothing in cause that necessitates the occurrence of the effect. In other words, one may observe an event regularly following another, but there's no coherent connection or power in the cause that compels the effect to happen. So just because you see the sun rise every day doesn't mean it's going to happen the next day. He said there's no causal chain between this. So a rationalist, on the other hand, would contend that knowledge is of cause and effect is at least at least in part a priori, that is independent of experience. So Kant argued that while experience is necessary to shape our understanding of a cause and effect, our mind contributes its own a priori concepts or categories of the mind. I'll explain that, such as causation, to organize and make sense of that understanding. So Kant is basically asking whether concepts revolve, or is asking whether our concepts revolve around the objects, or is it the opposite, that objects revolve around our concepts? So does the mind conform to the world, or does the world conform to the mind? And this is Kant's Copernican revolution, is to say the reverse. In other words, that the mind actively constructs experience through a priori categories rather than passively reflecting on reality, which is something I'll explain later. And he has a quote from his this book. It's all about Kantian metaphysics. It's called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's quite a thick book. And he says in the preface to the second edition, he says, Thus far, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to objects. On that proposition, however, all our attempts to establish something about them a priori by means of concepts through which our cognition would be expanded have come to nothing. Let us, therefore, try to find out by experiments whether we shall not make better progress in problems of metaphysics if we assume that objects must conform to our cognition. So basically, the objects must conform to our cognitive faculties. So our knowledge isn't a passive reflection of like independently existing reality, but it's shaped by the inherent structures of our mind. And our minds are constituted in such a way that they can only process information we get from experience through, and this process forces the world to conform to our mind. So if analogy for this, like if the mind is a projector, then if one has knowledge of the projector, then they have a priori knowledge of what's going on, that what's gonna be projected. And I'll discuss this projector analogy like towards the end of the video. So he also says in this preface, quote, before objects are given to me, that is a priori, I must presume in myself laws of the understanding which are expressed in concepts of a priori. To these conceptions, then all objects of experience must necessarily conform. So Kant is asserting that before we encounter specific objects in experience, our mind must already possess innate a priori categories. And these concepts are not derived from experience, but they're preconditions of understanding the world in our minds. So the objects that we encounter must conform to these inherent categories. And it's through the application of these categories that we're able to make sense and organize our experiences. So Kant proposed 12 categories. So for the concept of quantity, he said there's unity, plurality, and totality. For the concept of quality, he says there's reality, negation, and limitation. For the concept of relation, he said there's inherence, subsistence, that's one thing. And then he says that there's cause and effect, and there's community. So for the concept of modality, he said there's possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, and necessity and contingency. However, these 12 categories only apply within the realm of experience, and therefore metaphysical conceptions that are beyond experience, such as the nature of God or infinity or the soul, cannot be known, and this is what he calls his transcendental illusion. So we can't know anything about things in themselves, but we only know about their experience, about their appearances from experience, which is the phenomena. He calls this the phenomena, the things that we experience. But the things we don't know, he calls the noumena, the thing in itself. And the thing in itself can't be known, because this is called his Transcendental Idealism, and it goes with the projector analogy. With something we'll also discuss. So I mentioned at the beginning, if something is a priori, then its knowledge is it's known prior to experiencing it with our senses. For example, if we have a triangle, a triangle has 3 sides and its angles add up to 180 degrees. It's by the definition of a triangle that we know these things, and therefore it's analytic. It's also analytic, and it's also a priori. So, but if I were to say the triangle is red, then I would need a posteriori knowledge of it or experience of it. And it's also a synthetic judgment to say that the triangle is red, because on the definition of a triangle to be red. However, it's the case that we can understand a triangle having 3 straight lines only because we have the experience of space and geometry, and therefore it would be a posteriori as well. Furthermore, physics uses a priori claims about cause and effect to explain how objects will unnecessarily behave. So if we experience thunder, then we must know that the lightning causing it. Nevertheless, it does not pertain to the definition of thunder to be caused by something. A clap of thunder would still be thunder if nothing caused it, but we don't admit anything occurring without cause. Therefore, causality is a property that we might apply to event a priori. So how do we know? Where do we get this idea of causality being a priori? So this is what Kant tries to answer in his Critique of Pure Reason. He's trying to answer how one derives synthetic a priori reason, which is something that someone like Hume would deny. He would deny that there's something that's synthetic a priori. So like, what if like the idea of causality, time, and all the 12 categories mentioned above, like, did they come from our mind? Where did they come from? So Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic answers how space, time, and causality are a priori, as they originate from us and necessarily apply to all the objects we experience for that reason. So these 12 that I mentioned earlier, they're not optional or arbitrary, but are essential for any coherent human experience. So if one experiences a flash of lightning, they represent in their mind the lightning, but also themselves to whom the lightning is appeared, which leads to like self-recognition in our minds. So what we sense, such as like sight and sound and textures, must conform to us as a unity as in our mind that recognizes them as our minds are also a unity that we can recognize ourselves. And this applies to concepts such as causality, as well. We understand ourselves conceptually but not sensibly. And so concepts are a mechanism for instituting unity within our senses. So for example, one may experience a cat with its fluffiness and its whiskers and its tail, but our concepts put it all together as a cat, along with all other cats, like the universal of a cat. And objects that we may experience by conforming to the concepts of our minds or the act of self-consciousness. That's kind of confusing, but try to understand. I guess try to rewatch it if you have any, questions so far. But when we understand object through our experiences, we're looping our representations of ourselves through our senses and lining that up with the concept in our mind. So that makes it unity. So we recognize ourselves through the concepts, and therefore experiences conform to the concepts. And this is where he derived the 12 categories, that senses conform to concepts, and concepts are the function of judgments. So a new term here, judgments. And judgments are constructed in accordance to logical forms, which are basically hypothetical sentences that actually make sense of the world. And these logical forms that deal with sentences are called the categories. And they're what I mentioned above. And this is also known as the transcendental deduction of the categories. So abstract concepts such as causality can be deduced, since this reflect the basic rules of like the hypothetical sentences of the logical forms which all judgments are made. So in other words, Kant divided the consciousness into understanding, which produces concepts, and sensibility, which receives the 5 senses. The understanding of like the structures, thoughts, into these hypothetical sentences, we do that or our mind does that to make them intelligible. So these hypothetical sentences are based on what he calls like a table of judgments. And the table of judgments, briefly, is the blueprint of how we think, while the 12 senses are a tool that our mind uses to structure the raw input to make from the senses to create meaningful experiences. For example, judgments may include the judgments can be categorical, like A is B, or like the cat is fluffy. They could be hypothetical, if A then B. So if the cat is purring, then it's happy. Or it could be disjunctive, that it's either A or B, that the cat is either hungry or tired. So these like hypothetical sentences. And as mentioned, the 12 categories are the basic concepts of the mind and allow us to interpret and make sense of the sensory experiences. So causality, the cause and effect, is one like the 12 categories like I mentioned before. It allows us to think about sequences, events, and like relationships. So the understanding receives input from sensibility and it applies concepts like causality to it. So furthermore, for consciousness to make sense, it must be unified. Therefore, when the sensibility sends information to the understanding, it unifies it prior to the understanding and implies the table of judgments. So like I mentioned, the table of judgment is the blueprints and the 12 categories of the tools to make sense of the input from our senses. So the mind is constructing the world. And what we understand of the world is the phenomena, and what's the world in itself that's being constructed that we can't know is the noumena, and I'll discuss that in a bit. And so it's our understanding that prescribes the laws of causality, space and time. However, we can know anything prior to the mind receiving information about the noumenal world, which creates the distinction between the noumena and phenomenon, like I just said. So analogy for this is the projector. The mind is the projector, and the information that comes into this projector, perhaps a file, is the noumena, and it gives information about what is to be projected. It projects onto its screen of experience, and one can know something a priori about the thing that's being projected by knowing about the projector. For example, if we know the projector is only black and white, then we know a priori that the projection must be black and white. However, knowing the information about the projector and the things on the screen, we can't really say anything about the file itself. So there's no guarantee that the file obeys the laws of the projector. For example, if we know the projector is black and white as mentioned, it doesn't mean that the file is also black and white or has any color at all. It can just be zeros and ones. But there's no guarantee that what's being projected is similar to the actual file. And that's this distinction between the noumena and the phenomena is what he calls the transcendental idealism. And there's a quote. It's kind of a longer quote, but he says, but as for the cause, why people, being not satisfied by this substratum of sensibility, have added to the phenomena also noumena, that the pure understanding can think, it rests merely on the following. Sensibility in its realm, that of appearances, is itself limited by understanding that it deals not with things in themselves, but also with way in which, by virtue, our subject character, things appear to us. This was the result of the entire Transcendental Aesthetic, and from the concept of appearance and as such, too, it follows naturally that to appearance there must correspond something that is not in itself appearance. For appearances cannot be anything by itself and apart from our way of presenting. Hence, if we were not to go in a constant circle, then the word appearance already indicates reference to something that the direct presentation of which indeed sensible, by which in itself, even without this character of sensibility, on which the form of our intuition is based, must be something, i.e. an object independent of sensibility. Now from this consideration arises the concept of a noumena, and he talks about how we know a noumena exists and what it means for something to be noumena or phenomena. So that's basically a rundown of Kantian Metaphysics, and hopefully that made sense to you, and if not, just leave a comment below and I'll try to answer based off my knowledge of Kant. And like I said, usually for like other videos or the other sources, like what I did about Plato and Descartes, I would go back to the primary sources. But for Kant, since he's kind of difficult to read based off like the quotes I read so far, I would consume as many secondary resources as possible, such as what I have here, like the Cambridge Companion to Kant. I enjoyed reading this much. It kind of made things a bit easier. And hopefully this video may also make things easier in this, if you were to read the Critique of Pure Reason. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and yeah, that's basically it.